production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here and also a proud member. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, historian, attorney, and author of Ballots and Bullets, Black Power, Politics, and Urban Guerrilla Warfare in 1968 Cleveland, a good friend of the City Club's Jim Robenalt. Cleveland played a critical role in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, intersecting with some of the most important figures of the time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and many others all came to Cleveland to deliver important speeches, to organize Cleveland residents. It was 3 months after Robert F. Kennedy spoke in Cleveland that the Glenville shootout happened. Police battled with black nationalists in that neighborhood. The shootout left 10 dead and more than 15 wounded, mostly police. An uprising followed, inciting what would become a decades-long struggle between residents and the police. And 50 years later, we do tend to wonder how things have changed. These are topics that Mr. Robenalt, a local historian and author, explores in his book, and he will share with us today. In addition to Ballots and Bullets, he's written January 1973, Watergate, Roe v. Wade, Vietnam, and the Month That Changed America Forever, as well as 2 other nonfiction books dealing with the American presidency, Linking Rings, William W. Durbin and the Magic and Mystery of America, and The Harding Affair, Love and Espionage During the Great War. Mr. Robenalt is also a partner in business litigation at Thompson Hines Cleveland office. He's a recognized leader in judicial reform, and he has consistently been listed among the best lawyers in America and has been selected for inclusion in Ohio Super Lawyers. In 2011, do you get a jumpsuit with that? Yeah, okay. Thanks. In 2011, there's the S, all of it. Mr. Robenalt created a national continuing education program entitled the Watergate CLE that explores the complex ethical and legal dilemmas of Watergate. He presents that in partnership with John Dean, Nixon's former White House counsel. Robenalt graduated a member of Phi Beta Kappa with a BA from Miami University and from the Ohio State University Michael Moritz College of Law as a member of the Order of the Coif. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Jim Robenalt.
Well, he read that just as I wrote it, so I appreciate that, Dan. I'm really pleased to be here, and I want to thank a lot of people. We'll do that in the second half of the hour, but I got a lot to get to here. So I'm going to walk you through kind of a quick version of my book, but the reason I'm going to go at the speed I'm going to go is that I want you to hear some really important voices. I want you to hear from Malcolm X. I want you to hear from Dr. King. And I want you to hear from 2 people who spoke at the City Club, Bobby Kennedy and Vice President Hubert Humphrey. They play an important part in the story. So we'll get to that and we'll hear some of those segments. But this first picture that I am showing the people here is the day before Carl Stokes was elected. That's Dr. King shaking hands with Fred Ahmed Evans. Fred Evans would be the leader of a black nationalist group that would be involved in the shootout in the summer of 1968. So the guy in the middle of the picture is an FBI informant. But in any event, we'll come back to all that. So let me just tell you, this picture that I'm showing the audience here is Carl Stokes walking the streets of Huff 3 days before the shootout, commemorating the Huff riot that had happened 2 years earlier. And if you look closely, the 2 nationalists on each side of him have rifles on their shoulders. So this plays a role in the story that I'll tell you about later, but that was just 3 days before the shootout. As Dan said, I've got 4 books. This is the latest one. I have really never written a book that I thought I wanted to write. They all come to me, and I'll tell you about how this one came to me. But this is a picture of the people in Glenville a year ago at the site of the shootout, commemorating that shootout. And for these people and these citizens of Cleveland, the nationalists who were killed that day, as you see there, were martyrs. They are considered martyrs in the community. On the other side are the policemen who were killed that day. These are the three policemen killed at the scene. There were 12 others badly wounded. I mean, this was urban guerrilla warfare at its worst. And these guys are seen as heroes by people in this community too. So this whole book starts with a secretary at my firm, Thompson Heim, whose father is pictured in the middle of this, was one of the first responders. Chester Zukowski is his name. And Chester showed up. He was shot 3 or 4 times, fell out of his car into the street, and his leg was essentially shot off. It was amputated. So he raised his 4 daughters, including Diane, who told me about her dad having been a policeman and having been shot. And I'm not from Cleveland originally. I grew up in Lima, Ohio. But I decided for some reason in the summer of 2016 to ask Diane, tell me more about your dad and what happened. So she did. This is the intersection where he was shot. She brought me in this book called Shootout in Cleveland. This was written in 1969 by a Case Western Reserve professor. And I was reading this book, and I'm not exaggerating, when on the television appeared news of the Dallas shooting in 2016, where a black nationalist, former veteran, took to the streets with the intent to ambush and kill as many white policemen as he could. This was a Black Lives Matter event not long after Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were killed, and this was a protest. So this is Micah Johnson. You notice the picture and notice that 50 years earlier, Fred Ahmed Evans, also an Army veteran and a black nationalist, ambushed police. So my question, as I watched that television and as I was reading about this 50 years ago, is why are we still here? What accounts for this? So, every book starts with a question, and that was my question, and I tried to answer it with this. And fortunately for me, there are a lot of people who have helped me write this book. It really starts 4 years earlier than 1968 in a church that is one of the most spectacular churches in Cleveland, Corey Methodist Church. How many people here have been to Corey Methodist Church? All right, so it is on East 105th Street. We have 2 of the pastors here from Corey Methodist, Reverend Roberson, who I'll talk about him a little bit later, but and right next door, Reverend Cavanis, Dr. Cavanis, who's Abyssinia Baptist Church. In any event, this church is, first of all, it started as a Jewish synagogue because Glenville started in many ways as a Jewish enclave. So this was built as a big, fantastic Jewish center. It has a swimming pool, it has a recreation center, but look at that sanctuary there. And I took a little more modern pictures of it here. But note the cross there. And I want you to notice something here. That's Dr. Martin Luther King in that pulpit in the spring of 1963. So I'll talk about that in a second. That's that pulpit again. And this is Malcolm X a year later. So we have the 2 great figures in the Black liberation movement speaking from the same pulpit here in Cleveland. And they're both very important speeches, both important to the civil rights movement and to the Black Power movement. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that. But the reason Corey is selected is it's so huge. They can hold 3,000 people. And so here is King back in '63 when he went to Birmingham for his direct action campaign. And of course, these images of kids being fire hosed by the Birmingham Fire Department and dogs being sicked on people, these changed everything. This was the spring of '63, and Dr. King, as you all know, went to jail as a result of violating an injunction not to march or to stop marching. And he wrote, while he was in jail, his very famous letter from Birmingham jail. That letter he brought with him to Cleveland when he came up to Cleveland to raise bail money for the people 3,000 people who had been jailed by Bull Connor. So he came up here, and when this picture is taken, he literally has the briefcase next to him that has the letter from Birmingham jail written on margins of newspapers that have been smuggled into him. Why did he come to Cleveland? He came to Cleveland because Cleveland is considered Alabama North. A lot of the migrants from the South came from Alabama. So he came up here, and Reverend Cavaness, you told me, and you worked with him a lot, that he loved Cleveland because of all the Alabama natives here. So he came up, raised the money, and then a few months later, this is the I Have a Dream speech in Washington, and then this. The 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham was bombed by white supremacists, and 4 young women were killed, 4 little girls were killed. And so the question is raised, what is the efficacy of nonviolence? You know, if you have people who act like this, is nonviolence really going to work? And so there's a whole group of people who started to believe that nonviolence was not the way to go, that armed self-defense was the way to go. One of them is Malcolm X. This is a horrific picture from Cleveland back at the time. This is, if you look in the back, it says Murray Hill there. And so this is trying to integrate our schools. This is the kind of violence that broke out during all of this. And it was during that time that the Congress on Racial Equality asked Malcolm X to come to Cleveland to speak. April 3rd, which you referenced in your 1964, he had just broken with the Nation of Islam. So he was doing a couple things here. He was talking about why he broke, but he also was saying in the past when he was with the Nation of Islam, there was no crossing the lines politically. People didn't vote. He's now saying, let's vote. Let's work together. And he also was taking the civil rights movement to a higher plane. He was going to talk about human rights, not just civil rights. And he said, most of the people in the world are of color, and this is a UN problem, not just a United States problem. So he comes to where? Corey Methodist Church to give this talk. And when he does so, he gives the first iteration, the first time he gives this speech, it's called the ballot or the bullet. It becomes one of his signature speeches, but it also, historians say it's like number 7 on the list of the most influential speeches of the 20th century, given here at Corey Church. And think about this. This is a black Muslim coming to a Christian church. So Reverend Robenalt and I talked about the Methodists, were large enough to allow him to come and speak. And so it makes it an extraordinary place because there aren't that many places where both King and Malcolm X spoke. I'm making a pitch for Corey that we got to save this place. It really is spectacular. If you haven't been there, go. They have Reverend Mills, the new pastor, is here. 10 o'clock services on Sunday morning. He'll be happy to have you there. All right, so here's what I want to get at. I want you to hear Malcolm X. There are 3 clips I want to play for you. And these were transformative for me to listen to and to get a feel for just what he was talking about. The question is, what is black nationalism? So all I got to do is find. There we go.
Mr. Moderator.
This is recorded in Detroit,
Reverend
9 days
Clean,
later.
Brothers and sisters, and friends, and I see some enemies. In fact, I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we had an audience this large and didn't realize that there were some enemies present. This afternoon, we want to talk about the ballot or the bullet. The ballot or the bullet explains itself. But before we get into it, since this is the year of the ballot or the bullet, I would like to clarify some things that refer to me personally concerning my own personal position. I'm still a Muslim. That is, my religion is still Islam.
Okay, so this is then what he says about we all have to work together, we all have to work as one nation.
Whether you are a Christian or a Muslim or a nationalist, We all have the same problem. They don't hang you because you're a Baptist, they hang you because you're black. They don't attack me because I'm a Muslim, they attack me because I'm black. They attack all of us for the same reason. All of us catch hell from the same enemy. We're all in the same bag, in the same boat. We suffer political oppression, economic exploitation, and social degradation. All of them from the same enemy. The government has failed us. You can't deny that. Anytime you live in the 20th century, 1964, and you walking around here singing, "We shall overcome," the government has failed. This is part of what's wrong with you. You do too much singing. Today it's time to stop singing and start swinging.
All right, so you get the idea. What he's saying is nonviolence doesn't work. We need armed self-defense, and we need to protect ourselves. And he suggests that people in the audience think about forming rifle clubs. And one of the guys who does is Lewis Robinson, who is one of the heroes of my book. And today, his widow, Beth Robinson Bosk, is here. And she also is a hero and one of the figures in the book. But Lewis Robinson starts the Medgar Evers Rifle Club, named after the assassinated civil rights leader. And the whole idea is armed self-defense. Well, this kind of talk gets you in trouble. Lewis Robinson was fired. He worked for the city. And he also caught the attention of the FBI. I'll let you read the book to get into all of this, but informants, the FBI, the COINTEL program, it's all part of this book and what happens. Malcolm X does not live out the year. He ends up being assassinated in New York in February of 1965, and then that summer, in Watts, riots begin. Now think about this. You just had the 64 Civil Rights Act, then the 65 Civil Rights Act, 2 weeks before Watts. And white America said, what is going on? We are having progress. What is going on here? Why are these cities going up in smoke? Why are people rioting and so forth? And the answer is too little, too late. The ghettos that had been formed in northern cities and in Los Angeles were festering places with bad sanitation, rats, and people couldn't move elsewhere because there wasn't open housing. So you had here in Huff, and I want to give you an idea. Huff today has about 17,000, don't hold me on these numbers. Back then it had like 70,000. People overcrowded, the schools overcrowded, conditions horrific, and so we have the Huff Rebellion in 1966 that comes to Cleveland, and this is the picture of the mayor at the time, Ralph Locher, walking the streets of Huff during that time. And so what happens? Well, Dr. King begins to move out of the South, where he'd had all these triumphs, Nobel Peace Prize, Times Man of the Year. He begins to move north because now he realizes that he's got to take his mission of nonviolence into the ghettos of the North. He goes to Chicago first, and you can read about this in the book, long story, but he ends up failing there. He tries to march for open housing, and there's horrific violence towards him and so forth. So where does he come? Well, he comes to Cleveland. And this story is not told enough. He comes to Cleveland. He spends most of the summer of 1967 supporting a candidate named Carl Stokes to run for mayor. This is just a real quick clip that with Dr. King coming to Cleveland, explaining what he is doing.
United States, we feel that over the last few years, through our nonviolent struggle, we have achieved moral power, and we have literally subpoenaed large segments of the nation to appear before the judgment seat of morality on the question of civil rights. Now it is necessary to transform this moral power into political power so that we can bring about the necessary political reforms that will solve the problems that we face.
Okay, so he comes here. Guess who doesn't want him to come here? Carl Stokes. He's worried that he will alienate people. King gives this magnificent speech at Glenville High School, not far from where this shootout will happen in '67. Go listen to it. It's online. It's really inspirational. But he had just said that he was against the Vietnam War 3 weeks earlier. So he had 2 strikes against him, civil rights and anti-war. And Stokes didn't want him to be here to alienate the few whites that he knew he needed to get. So you will not see pictures of Carl Stokes walking with Martin Luther King. And yet he's here, and he comes and he meets with the United Pastors and Fred Ahmed Evans, who is a black nationalist. He realizes he's got to reach out to this community, and he does. And so this is a picture of him with Evans in the summer of '67. I showed you this picture earlier where he's back here. Now let me tell you about this picture because it's phenomenal. This picture is taken, as I said, the day before Carl Stokes is elected. Martin Luther King had gone back to Birmingham to serve out 5 days in jail when the United States Supreme Court on his appeal said, no, you shouldn't have violated that injunction. You got to go back and serve out your full sentence. Anybody know that? He actually goes back to Birmingham. And what does he do when he gets out of jail? He comes to Cleveland. Why? Because he wants to be here when Stokes wins. This is the big moment. And look very carefully at the footage from that night when Stokes barely wins. King is here, and you won't see him there. Lou Stokes holds him in a hotel room. And as I've said to various people, you can't blame Carl Stokes, who was trying to put together a coalition government. And it was a really difficult time. You also can't blame King for feeling upset about this. Coretta Scott King told Ebony magazine that he thought that was one of the greatest snubs of his life. So he leaves Cleveland, and this is, I don't have enough time to play you this, but this is a Huff Church the next day where he's predicting winter riots. He's very embittered. And then we get to 1968, and the Kerner Commission comes out. It was put together by Johnson after the Detroit riots in '67, and it's a remarkable report because it talks about how we are all separate but equal. But what it does, most importantly, it points the finger at white Americans for the ghettos. It says specifically, what white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. This is a presidential commission like the Warren Commission coming out with this report in February '68. So my point is, right track. We're on the right track to think about this. Johnson has the war on poverty, and then King is assassinated. So things begin to unravel. Obviously, this is a huge blow to the civil rights movement, but also to the black nationalists who King was reaching out to, including Fred Ahmed Evans. Around the country, the cities go up in smoke, that Washington, but not here in Cleveland, because we elected an African-American mayor, and Stokes and Ahmed Evans walked the streets of Huff and Glenville to keep it cool that night. One of the few places where that happened. And the next day, Robert Kennedy came to the City Club of Cleveland, and he gave a talk which is his greatest moment, which has become known as the mindless menace of violence speech. And if I can get let's listen to just a segment of it.
It is not a day for politics. I have saved this one opportunity, my only event of today, to speak briefly to you about the mindless menace of violence in America, which again stains our land and every one of our lives. It is not the concern of any one race. The victims of the violence are black and white, rich and poor, young and old, famous and unknown. They are, most important of all, human beings whom other human beings loved and needed.
Fred Vero, who's here today, was the Dan Moulthrop of his time, and he could, if you want to know the story about how he got RFK here and what happened that morning when they had to decide whether Kennedy was going to give a speech to the City Club or go to a church in Huff, he ended up coming to the City Club to give this magnificent speech. And Fred, thanks for being here. Across the street, this is a picture of Old Stone Church where a memorial was taking place for Dr. King. The mayor, Carl Stokes, was weeping during most of it, and he creates something called Cleveland Now. How many people here know of Cleveland Now? All right, so Cleveland Now comes out of King's assassination. The idea is a memorial fund for housing, jobs, trying to alleviate conditions. It's the war on poverty in microcosm here in Cleveland. Look at that number, though. It morphs into, within a month, $1.2 billion in 1968 dollars over 10 years for jobs, recreation centers in Huff. Imagine had that money been spent. But again, tragedy intervenes here. This is a picture of Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, now the heir apparent, as Bobby Kennedy had been killed in June. This is July 2, 1968. He wears a Cleveland Now button, and he's there with Stokes. So let's listen to his voice, because he speaks also to the City Club. To me, this is a very important speech that's been forgotten in history. And I'll tell you why in a minute, but let me just play the introduction here. Oops. This is what happens when you do this. Okay. Fix it in post. Yeah. There it is. This is at the Sheraton Hotel, which is now the Renaissance.
Mayor Stokes, my good friend Carl, and my longtime friend and congressional associate John Gilligan,
who become governor,
members of the City Club, friends and fellow citizens here in Cleveland, Ohio. Some of you may note, if your vision is as good as I think it is, that I wear a button that says Cleveland Now. Carl Stokes wears a pin that says Humphrey for President. It's a fair deal. Cleveland Now, Carl, Humphrey in November.
All right, so why is this speech so important to me? It's so important because what he came here to talk about, and the reason he used Cleveland Now, is he was proposing a Marshall Plan for our cities. The same idea of how we saved Europe after the Second World War. He wanted to apply that sort of will, that sort of financial backing to get into our cities and make things better. And so he looks at Cleveland Now as a model. And here's the tragedy. On the same day that he's here, Fred Ahmed Evans, fed up with police violence, fed up with about to be evicted for the fourth time, goes out and uses Cleveland Now money to buy rifles. And he uses that money to then buy ammunition, and then he attacks the police with Cleveland Now money. This 3 days after this walk through Huff by Mayor Stokes. And Stokes is wearing a Cleveland Now button in this picture. He has no idea what's about to happen. This will ruin his mayorship. This will ruin Cleveland Now. This will be part of the great backlash that ends the Great Society and the war on poverty. And here we are 50 years later, because the violence kind of engulfed the remedy before the remedy had a chance to take hold. I find it offensive that yesterday there was some statement by the present administration that they've solved the war on poverty. You know, it's ridiculous. And this is the reason. And so you have a whole group of people in a white backlash that bring in Richard Nixon. They blame the victims of racism for the consequences of racism. And so we have Fred Ahmed Evans, who goes to jail. You can read about the shootout. You can read about the trial. He dies. This is a picture of him in the Ohio Penitentiary. He dies. But this brings in Richard Nixon. And so that is the Nixon counter-revolution. And we have been cycling through that counter-revolution for 50 years in one form or another. Even the Clinton administration has the 3 strikes you're out, lock them up mentality, putting huge numbers of African American in jail. And so that's why we have Black Lives Matter 50 years later. That's why we suffer these ambushes 50 years later. And who comes to Cleveland to make Richard Nixon's exact same speech from 1968, but Donald Trump in 2016, 2 weeks after the Dallas shootings? And we know that he's mimicking Nixon because a guy named Paul Manafort, anybody hear of him? Now in jail, was the campaign manager, and Paul Manafort told the press that Trump was mimicking Richard Nixon's speech to provide what? Law and order. And what is that? It's a code for racism. It's a code for locking people up. It's the war on crime. And it's, we're not going to spend money on poverty. So that's that. And I'll end with this because we need to get to the break here. Susan Goldberg, I want to bring it back to Cleveland again. Susan Goldberg was here just a few weeks ago. She was the first female editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer. My wife, Joanna, worked for her. And she went on to become the first female editor of the National Geographic. And she spoke here, as you can see, just a few weeks ago. But she put out this spectacular issue. This is in April of 2018. It's her race issue. And what they say here should change all of our perspectives and should be a basis for beginning to change our perspectives. Science now tells us, all this DNA that we've done helps us with health and everything else, but it tells us this. What is race, this says exactly? Science tells us there is no genetic or scientific basis for it. Instead, it's largely a made-up label used to define and separate us. We're all the same. We all come from the same Africans who came out of Africa. But genetic research, they say, the first is all humans are closely connected. We are more identical to each other than chimpanzees in Africa. Studies of human genetics have allowed scientists to reconstruct a kind of family tree of human populations. And that, Nat Geo explains, has revealed the second deep truth. In a very real sense, all people alive today are Africans. So Cleveland was on the right track. We fell off that track. We can get back on that track, and we can start changing our perspectives about race and understanding it's a myth that separates us for no good reason. So with that, I think I've got to stop and go to the break, and then we'll come back for Q&A. There you go. I got city there.
Yeah, you did. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, and those of you joining us via the radio broadcast or our live stream. If you'd like to tweet a question, you can tweet it at the City Club, and our team will work it into the program. Holding our microphones today are Content Coordinator Bliss Davis and Youth Forum Council Chair Tiolu Orsanya. May we have our first question, please?
Could you put what you just said in the context of what's going on now in terms of the immigrant rights struggle?
It's a good question. This book is not about immigration, but there are a couple of observations I would make. The first is that when you saw Dr. King come from Birmingham, that was back at a time when Bull Connors was putting children in cages. And here we are 50 years later putting children in cages. It's outrageous. The second thing, though, is that Cleveland, and if the people from WKYC are here, who've done great coverage. They've had 3 specials, Tom Meyer, Chris Cantor-Gianni, producer. They've done 3 specials, 1 more tonight. And Chris and I did a 6-part podcast. The first episode's up, and for the next 6 weeks it'll come out. But the policemen who we interviewed and talked to, who are magnificent people, talked about how Cleveland was an immigrant place and how when they were kids, everybody had a foreign parent. And they all got along, and they all mixed together. The only people they didn't mix with are the African Americans. But to them, this was a golden place to be because of the immigrants and because of the richness of Cleveland culture as a result of that. So that would be my answer to your question. Next question.
Thank you, Jim, for your tremendous research and great speech, encouraging us all to realize the problems here in Cleveland with racism, continuing racism. But here's my question. It seems like history repeats itself. The title, Ballots or Bullets. Back 50 years ago, it looked like bullets is what took us down. The fact that Cleveland now was taken down by a violent effort with rifles. Right. Today, gun violence is as high as it's ever been. And the alternative, ballots, again, today, now, seems to be the best alternative, where there is tremendous effort by many to register people to vote, to get them to vote. And I would like to know if your research indicated what efforts there were on the other side, on registering people to vote, on the ballot effort back 50 years ago. As today, that's where the effort is now.
Yeah, thanks, Jan. I agree with both of your observations. Back then, and you remember the Eyes on the Prize series? There is a series on Cleveland. I recommend you go read it or look at it now that you've heard this talk. They talk about how they had the get out the vote effort back then. Because it's interesting, they not only was it getting people to vote, but to make them understand that there was a primary and then there was a general election. So the big effort actually came after the primary when Stokes, beat Locher by like 18,000 votes. Everybody thought, I voted, No, you've got to go a second time. You've got to go for the general election. And that was a huge effort to get those voters out. And so they ended up doing that and getting people out. But it was a great race, actually. His opponent was Seth Taft, a former Jones Day lawyer. Dick Pogue is here, my friend. But Seth Taft was not a racist. At least I'm sure he had implicit bias, as we all do. But he insisted that race not be brought into the whole campaign. He was spectacular, and he made a comeback. Stokes only won by about 2,500 votes. Seth's son, Rick, is a big participant here at the City Club. So is Rick here? There you are, Rick. Okay. I didn't mean to give you a plug.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Merle.
Hi. I want to first thank you for writing about Glenville. I went to nursery school at Corey Church, and I was at Glenville when Dr. King spoke, so it really brings back some very warm memories. My question is, when you write your books, especially this book, is there anything that you would like to happen as a result of writing the book, or do you write the book just to share knowledge with your reading public?
That's a good question, Merle. Thanks. Yeah, I absolutely want something to happen. The book is written, the first, 28 chapters are history, hard history, what happened. I try to do it as carefully as I can. I had both help from the police. I had help from former black nationalists. And the police, actually, there were heroic people that day. The story is very complex. But then I take the opportunity at the very end of the book, my final chapter, is to talk about how when Dallas happened in 2016, President Obama wrote an open letter to law enforcement saying, we appreciate everything you do. We rely on you. We know your sacrifice. And it's a beautiful letter. But he also references, of all things, Bobby Kennedy's speech to the City Club of Cleveland. And if you go read it, he says, when he was, we have somebody else who is Attorney General who spoke about the menace of violence after another tragedy. He doesn't even mention that it's Martin Luther King being assassinated. But he's saying what Kennedy saw and what he talked about is that we all have to treat each other as neighbors, not as people we live in the same city with. And we are a community. It's a beautiful letter. And so from my perspective, what I say is if we could hit the restart button, go back to January 1968, before all the violence, before the assassinations, with the Kerner Commission saying, the ghettos are a white-created problem, with the war on poverty, with Cleveland Now. If we could go back and hit that reset button, we would be so much better off. And it's time to do that. I mean, we're 50 years out, and conditions, in many ways, are worse in some ways, in various places. And so that is my message. I do want it to be a call to action, but it is a history book, too. So that's at the very end. But thank you.
How's it going, Jim? I have one question. So what is one important message you would want young, aspiring community activists to take away after reading your book?
Great question. And I didn't give it to him either. What I would want you to do is to meet Don Freeman, who's here. Don Freeman and his wife, Norma, two of you could stand so that people can see you. And Don Freeman started a group called the Revolutionary Action Movement, which is the precursor to the Black Panthers. He knew Malcolm X very well. He spoke at events with him. And he became an activist. As he puts it in the WKYC clips, he was a high school teacher by day and a revolutionary by night. And he really was. I mean, he was the thinker of the movement. He had another guy named Max Stanford who was more the action guy, and he was more of the thinker. But he gets fired as a teacher when they find out he works for RAM and just persecuted. But both he and Norma have stayed in Glenville to this day, and they've done it purposely as everything falls around them to continue to support that community and to have forums. They have, people to their house, and it's wonderful, all the people. They knew Fred Evans. He came to their house. But what I would say to young people is talk to people like him who have been through the struggle. Talk to Dr. Cavanis, who's been through the struggle. Talk to Reverend Roberson and get their perspective and understand that what these guys all stand for is they act on what they believe. They don't just walk, they walk the walk instead of just talk the talk. So that's what I would recommend to you.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for giving the presentation today. It was fascinating to learn a lot of the history that we have here locally. So my question is, when you look at the public policy implications of racial discussions, so look at even the latter part of your presentation where you talked about race as a social construct. Right. I hear there's a lot of people who will say, why can't we do away with race? So why are we perpetuating these same type of structural kind of elements? And you look at the disparities that existed back then, and as you said in your speech, you see a lot of those same kind of disparities today, but you see the rationale of let's take away race. You see the weakening of affirmative action. You see the weakening of the Voting Rights Act. Right. So what do you say to individuals who say, let's do away with race, when there are others who are arguing that race continues to play a prominent role in the structural element of our communities? What do you say to those people who want to do away with race as a social construct?
And by the way, tell everybody who you are and what your role is.
So my name is Will Tarter. I work at the Center for Community Solutions Public Policy think tank, but I'm also the second vice president of the NAACP here in Cleveland. Yeah. So for me, this is a fascinating conversation, the intersection of public policy and disparities and how they treat the communities.
Yeah, great question. And the quick answer to it is that I want everybody to understand that race is a construct and hopefully change people's minds. I mean, if you start, one of the reasons that race got a foothold is, these horrible scientists who started talking about the differences and eugenics and all the rest of that bunk, but it really sunk in, and it made people think somebody is really different from me. Well, we're not. So I want that change of perspective, but we have lived in a world of racism, and so there still is a need for overcoming that through programs and so forth based on race. I'm all for still doing that because it's not going to just disappear overnight, and there's remedies that are needed based on the former racial categories that we should have in our heads. But the hope is both things could happen. So good question. Who's next? Richard Pogue.
Where did the $1.2 billion come from, and what do you think would have happened to Cleveland now if it hadn't been for the rifles?
Yeah, so good question from a Jones Day guy. Where's this money coming from? I gotta know. By the way, Dick Pogue is an icon. I mean, he's to all of us. And he and I have been friends in a goofy group called the Court of Nisi Prius, where we dress and sing and dance. But the money came from, and this would be of interest to you because as I've talked to you about, Jack Revis was very involved in helping Carl Stokes and helping all of this. But a bunch of it came from the business community who promised money and jobs. Some of it came from the city, some from the state, but the huge grants were going to be from the federal government, part of this war on poverty. So it was a magnificent effort put together by Stokes and his Silvers, what's his name? The guy who was the PR guy back then. Yeah, Bill Silverstein, or how do you say his name? Silverman. Yeah, Bill Silverman. Yeah, came up with this idea because, after King was assassinated, Stokes met with community leaders, and they all came in very concerned. That they had just had this revolution by electing him the previous November, and they were concerned about it. And they all said, what can we do? And Silverman took him out in the hall and he said, you just got a blank check, go back in and tell him, give me money. And one of the guys who helped do that was George Steinbrenner, who had a under 40 type group of people. But everybody pitched in to start working towards this goal, and then it was just destroyed by this violence. But most of the money would have come from the federal government, the war on poverty. And we had enough money to do that. And we were fighting a stupid war where we were spending a lot more money than that at the time. Okay.
I wanted to know what you think about the situation, the role of the FBI in so much of what went on in Cleveland. And it seems to me that there is this kind of myth that there was that bad FBI and now the good FBI. When the FBI has been a force of policing dissent since World War I. And nowadays, you can see it in, for instance, we were in the Republican National Convention, and the FBI started visiting people who were active in organizing demonstrations for that. And I was even visited by 2 Cleveland detectives. I kind of got into an amusing exchange with a friend of mine who's saying, oh, I didn't rate a visit by the police, but you did, Randy? So that was an amusing side to it. But it seems like you got to understand, you got to appreciate that the tiger has not entirely lost its stripes, even though Trump is beating up on them now, and they're temporarily liberal heroes.
Right.
So I just wondered if you could reflect on the experience of the FBI, and if these activists, young activists, get going again, they're going to go and become familiar with the FBI too.
Yeah. Interesting observation. Let me just say one thing about police and about FBI. We as a society put them in a terrible position. These are people who want to serve. Some of the policemen who were shot and killed that day and the others who were injured are wonderful human beings. They want to serve their community. They do it at making very little money. And we're asking them to solve the problem that we all make. What the Kerner Commission talks about. We are all implicated in it. And then we have the police go out and deal with the consequences. So we put them in a bad position. That said, the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was horrific. He started this thing called COINTELPRO. It starts with an anti-communist movement within the FBI to go after communists, to infiltrate, to get informants, to go in and destroy them from within. And it morphs in the 60s to an anti-black movement, especially black nationalists, Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael. All these people were on the list, and they all were surveilled. But not only that, the FBI set up this huge informant network. Huge. And they called it the Ghetto Listening Post. Gives you an idea of what's going on. And Hoover directs his FBI agents in 67, to go after and disrupt and do things like go to the newspapers and plant stories and do things like make the people within the group wonder who is the Judas in this group, to unsettle the group and so forth. It was very effective. They absolutely were very destructive. They accomplished their goal, but it was through, very improper means, and certainly something that none of us should be proud about. So I can't really talk about what the FBI is still doing. I wouldn't do that, but I can talk about what I know because I went to the National Archives working on this story on a Saturday and found the FBI files, the COINTELPRO files on Fred Ahmed Evans, and there were 400 pages on him, everything about him, and an informant who was literally with him the night before the shootout happened, and they went to Detroit. This, by the way, was supposed to be a kickoff of not just Cleveland, but Detroit, Chicago. It was supposed to be a semi-national kickoff of, ambushing police. And this guy would run away and go to a payphone and call the FBI guy who took down exactly what was going on. So they They knew what was about to happen. The Cleveland police knew what was about to happen, and a fatal call was made by the safety director for Carl Stokes. Hey, they have guns. Everybody's allowed to have guns. That's the Second Amendment. And so they did no search warrant. They didn't go in and try to stop it. They just put surveillance there, and that made Ahmed Evans think he was about to be attacked, and that's how it started. So there's a lot of blame to go around, and we all need to look in the mirror about what we think about some of these institutions. Dick Perry.
That wonderful presentation, Jim, but there's one thing that we don't talk about that happened in Cleveland in 1964 when the Republican Governors Association met here and chose to endorse Barry Goldwater for president. That marked the change of the control of the Republican Party from the Easterners to these very right-wing Republicans, and they kept moving to the right ever since with each president. So my question is isn't there a risk of putting too much emphasis on the impact of these individual acts and current events that happen and really ignore the much larger and more basic trends that are happening in the country, and winding up with the kind of a false explanation of how we got to where we are?
Yeah, good question. Dick Perry, by the way, former Call and Post reporter, then plain dealer. In the night of the shootout, how long had you been with the Call and Post?
3 weeks.
3 weeks. And he hears about this, and what does he do? He goes over to the scene, because he's a reporter, and that's what you do. And he shows up at great danger to his life and then reports on it and you do a lot of very important reporting on the trials too, and all this, and you were helpful to me, so I appreciate that. Your question's a good one, that you can emphasize something too much and get a false history about all of it. But let me just say one thing about this. I have gone around the country with John Dean speaking about Watergate, and two things from your question come to mind. First of all, he was best friends with Barry Goldwater Jr. They swam together at some prep school, so he knew Senator Goldwater, and he helped Senator Goldwater begin a book that's called Conservatives Without Conscience. And his point is Goldwater would be nowhere near where the Republican Party is today. He would be a centrist, if not a liberal. That changed. The Goldwater idea is more of a libertarian type thing. In fact, he was in favor of abortion. So the other thing is, I did write the book January 1973 because John and I were working on what happened. The Watergate burglars trial was that month. End of the Vietnam War, Johnson dies, Truman dies. But in addition, Roe v. Wade is decided. And so I wrote about that. My source was Lewis Powell's law clerk. And that event, though, you talk about an event that changes our politics, that gave rise to the religious right, who became, the evangelicals becoming the T-evangelicals and the Tea Party. And guess what they say? Abortion is wrong, it's evil, it's murder. That's their viewpoint. And my opponent is not just politically wrong-headed, they are evil. And I'm not going to compromise with them. And so here we are with people who won't compromise with each other. And I think you can't overstate the impact of Roe. And as we see today, a lot of people voted for Trump because of the Supreme Court. And they want to see Brett Kavanaugh become Supreme Court justice. They want to see Roe overturned. That's so big to them. So there are things you can point to and say, this is history, and this is very impactful about what happens.
Thanks again, Jim. My question is, in our schools, especially here in Cleveland, we don't ever learn about these types of events that happened in our own backyard. It's more so on a national scale. And so it's causing people in our generation to believe, oh, maybe up north it wasn't that. Things like this did not happen. Right. So you talked about how this was like Alabama North, that was viewed that way. Yep. So do you believe that the racism up here is still not only a mindset, and then after that, what can we do to try and break that chain, to try and make some change? Yeah, great question. It was interesting because when King came up to Chicago, he had no idea what he was going to face. He had some idea, but he had no idea how fierce it was going to be. And what he said is the bigots in Mississippi could learn something about hate from the people in Chicago. And it's true.
And it's still true. We still have it named that, and Dan's standing up because I got to stop here soon. But my remedy is we need to spend as much money as it takes to fix our neighborhoods, to fix our schools, to fix, to get people jobs that are important. And we need to change this perspective that if you could get people just thinking scientifically we're not different, all of a sudden I think that kind of changes the conversation. So we're kind of at a nice moment to do that. That would be my hope.
If you're joining us on the radio, that was a standing ovation. Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a forum with Jim Robenalt. He's a historian, attorney, and author of Ballots and Bullets, Black Power, Politics, and Urban Guerrilla Warfare in 1968 Cleveland. That brings us to the end of our program today. I'm grateful to you, Jim, grateful to all of you for joining us here today, but especially Jim for bringing so much history back to the present for us, both in the people you brought with you, and the presentation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Our forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org. Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland Incorporated.